Hi, this is Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross, bringing you the Inclusive Minds podcast. This podcast was inspired by the book of which I'm a co-editor entitled Anti-Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies, Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism. If you're a psychologist, a social worker, an addiction professional, or a healthcare provider, or anyone who wants to broaden your horizons, then this podcast is for you. The goal of the podcast is to help you understand some of the more complex issues facing our culture today. My guests are experts in their fields, and we'll be talking about a wide array of topics, including cross-cultural issues, the intersection of race and trauma, social justice, and health inequities. They will be sharing both their lived experiences and their expert opinions. The goal is to give you a felt experience and to let you know that you're not alone in being confused by these complex issues. We want to provide nuanced information with context that will enable you to make your own decisions about these important topics. Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross. Welcome to the Inclusive Minds podcast. I have with me my special guest, Tiffany Alvarez-Benford, who is a licensed independent clinical social worker who practices in Massachusetts, North Carolina, Vermont, and soon Denver, Colorado. With 20 years of personal experience in self-healing and recovery from complex PTSD, she has dedicated a 15-year career to trauma-informed care, focusing on resilience and the lasting impact of trauma on the body and the mind. Tiffany's work centers on how identity, intersectionality, and social factors shape our experiences, and she is committed to helping clients overcome barriers to living authentically and joyfully by addressing the roots of isolation and disconnection. Welcome to the show, Tiffany.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I also wanted to just remind you that Tiffany is one of the authors of our book, Anti-Blackness and the Stories of Authentic Allies, Lived Experiences in the Fight Against Institutionalized Racism. Her chapter is entitled Mixed Messages, Navigating the Intersections of Identity and Intergenerational Trauma. So, Tiffany, you have an amazing story, and it highlights some of the themes that you talk about in your chapter, including the theme of intergenerational trauma, as well as intersectionality and of identity and so on. Well, let's start with talking about the intergenerational trauma and a little bit about your mother's story and the trauma that she experienced growing up.
So my mother grew up during the Cuban Revolution. And my grandfather worked for the Batista regime, which was in power. And they were separated. They tried to leave Cuba. And during the revolution, my family had a rift of what side was going to allow safety. And after a storm actually blew my family and other families shipwrecked back to Cuba, they were separated then.
So your mother and her parents tried to escape Cuba.
Yeah.
They were one of the boat people who tried to leave during the Batista regime. But it blew them back into Cuba? Is that?
Basically a shipwreck of, I don't think they got very far. Remember, Cuba and Florida they're only 90 miles, right? So it didn't take much to get them back. But they were, when I hear the stories of my family, my mom talks about this joy of feeling like, oh, we're on other land. And then they were met with militia. There was the resistance, and my grandparents were imprisoned for basically, my mom remembers it from about 7 to 14, 13. They were her and her siblings, which she has 5, were all put in what were known as almost like detention camps, so more like orphan, with nuns and, a lot of indoctrination. And she did not connect with her parents again until they were finally allotted resettlement And then when they resettled in the U.S., they were actually sent to Seattle, Washington, where they had never seen snow.
So, oh my goodness. And how many people spoke Spanish there?
No, like none. I'm sure some, but she didn't know many of them. When they did finally in my mother's senior year, she talks about being ripped out of a community she had just started to sort of get used to, and then being brought back to Miami, where it was the joy of being around Cuban culture. But there was that developmental rip again that happened, which I think is...
So the first riff was when she was put in the orphanage in Cuba after she was separated from her parents when they blew back into Cuba.
Right.
Trying to escape. And then she settles in Seattle and kind of becomes used to that. And then she's ripped again when your parents decide to move back to Miami. These were all, I'm assuming, pretty traumatic experiences for her.
And I think one of the things that was very important that does really talk about how it impacts me is the messaging at home. There's so many strengths in my family, in my Cuban family, but the messaging was assimilate, being any kind of other, having darker skin, which my grandfather was darker than my grandmother. My mom had more wild, free, natural, kinky, what is associated with Afrocentric Black hair as we know it. And so there was a lot of mixed messaging. And remember, this is also occurring in the revolution of the gender revolution in the U.S. So we have to think about the socio-political impact of the messaging in the U.S. compared to what my mother experienced in Cuba. So it's very different. And there was a lot of don't talk about our experience because my grandfather was severely traumatized in prison. The law of the land in the home was, we don't talk about Cuba. We come here. We are proud of our culture. We do not speak English in our home, but speak English outside the home. Date lighter skin, white men who have the ability to take care of you. Was some of the messaging, because there was the gender dynamic as well. In the Latino community, there was, especially during the 50s and 60s, the traditional mindset was, you become a wife. You become a wife, you have children.
Get married, have kids.
There wasn't a lot of pursue in education. There wasn't a lot of pursue for the sake of self, which I think did impact, for sure, my growing up and my brothers growing up.
When you come into the family, there are already 2 generations of trauma. Your grandparents were traumatized in prison. Your mom was traumatized both in the orphanage or detention camp where she lived, and then being, separated from her parents for 7 years, really important child development years, and then being taken to a new place, Seattle, Washington, and then back to Miami. All of these things were compounding, I would expect.
And happening before 18 for my mom and most of her siblings. And the one thing I did leave out is my grandmother gave birth while in prison in Cuba. And she gave birth to what we would now see as an individual who was presenting with mute autism. And he lived with her until his almost death in his early 50s, about 4 years ago.
So they're living in Miami when your mother marries your father and when you're born.
And this is the early 80s.
This is the early 80s now. So looking back, how did their trauma impact your growing up years?
So I think when we're talking about intergenerational trauma and the impact, one of the things for me that's important, both in my life and with my clients, is remembering that trauma impacts our nervous system in the body. And when we're dealing with a parent or any caretaker with a dysregulated nervous system, where, if you think about when a wave hits you and you come up for air and you get the air, but if there's wave after wave after wave, you're going to be gasping rather than grabbing a normal breath. And I feel like that is what I saw sometimes play out in my life. With my mom's, with the parenting. There was dysfunctionality due to addiction, which usually can be seen. And
It's also highly associated with trauma.
highly associated, better terminology. So when you dealt with a dysregulated parent, how I got messages around even, and these are subtle messages. These were not direct. I think that's very important. These were not direct messages of my mom sitting down and telling me this per se, but messages I heard from my grandparents to my mom, or in the ways, in the behaviors of, we don't talk about what happens in our home. We don't talk about what happened in Cuba. Emotions that were big were not to be expressed. My mother specifically had issues as my brother and I got older. Actually, funny enough, right around 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, because I've had so many patients who've recognized the same thing, that that their parents started having issues at the same age where they had been traumatized.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So I heard these messages in subtle ways. I think one of the gifts I had, and one of the gifts that a lot of people can have that experience trauma at early development, is you become, what we know now can turn into hypervigilant, right? But
Yes.
that allows you to read the room, that allows you to connect with emotions. And I see that play out in some gifted ways in my life, was through dance, through writing, through my love of music. Those were also resilient strategies that I did see my family have, which I think is important. We often think only about the impact negatively, but there were a lot of things that I saw my mom do. But mostly it was that lack of presence I felt in my mom's own body at home. I didn't know that then, but what I experienced was a sense of loneliness all the time. I also would go to school and be like, am I allowed to own my blackness, own my brownness? I had my dad's good hair. These were the terminologies. It was straighter hair, where I envied my mother's hair. I felt like it was the symbol of our culture and how free the Cuban music and the food and all of the things that I love, I saw was letting her hair down and being natural, letting her skin be dark. But the message I think my mom internalized was that that meant she wasn't good enough.
And also that pressure to assimilate that you talked about. So one of the parenting strategies, or one of the parenting issues that you talked about in your chapter, has to do with how your mother's own emotional dysregulation made it difficult for her to accept your emotions. Like you weren't, like you said, not able to express anything that was, to get really upset or to get really sad or anything like that.
Right. And also being the older sister, which you'll see this, I think, in many Black and brown families, but being the eldest sibling, I was also expected to do a lot of parenting young age, when I had no idea what parenting was, nor should we, right? We're children ourselves. My mom would sometimes leave a lot. She herself did not experience addiction in the form of substance or alcohol, which was very interesting. But she did marry or attract, usually partners, that experienced addiction or high forms of violence and aggression. And
there was domestic violence that you witnessed in the family as well.
Yes, not with my biological father, but with the father of my brother.
Yeah. So all of these kinds of things are on the adverse childhood experiences study, showing that it puts the children at much higher risk for addictions and, eating disorders and so much more, depression, anxiety, etc. So when you became an adult, and what drew you to work with people with trauma like yourself? In your bio, we talked about that you had healed from complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you say a little bit about this complex PTSD, and then about your adulthood and how you came into this field?
Yeah. So I think, I hit a bottom at 23. And when I say hit a bottom, it was a moment of leveling out, despair, physically, emotionally, mentally, even getting great grades. At 17, experienced, my father leaving and having gambling. I was on my own by the time I was 17. And so from 17 to 23, which is also developmental for, going into younger adulthood, I had my own afflictions with addiction and also working in South Florida, the pressure of colorism, the messaging around weight, around, I worked in restaurant, nightlife, entertainment before getting into the field of clinical education. Before I was a non-traditional student. Went to college for the first time at 25.
Okay.
And so my journey of recovery began at 23 years old, when from 13 to 23, I had really no substantial relationship with my own mother. So at 23, I reached out to my mother in a moment of despair. I call it my divine moment, God moment, my aha. Yeah. And I reached out, I think, from almost like that guttural feeling, that primal of needing mom. Yeah. And I reached out, and it was the first time my mother, I think, was stable enough, had some time of her own healing, and had been in a new partnership where she was loved and did not have a partner struggling with these things. That she said, yes, come. And it was about 2 years of living with my mom and going to a trauma institute in Miami and getting with a trauma-informed therapist who understood what intergenerational trauma was.
Yeah.
Defined it for me in therapy, helped me make connections around not so much my body yet, about where does joy live, where does pain live in my body, but just started getting me into my body.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think one of the things to really point out is the disassociation that can happen. This disconnect from our own bodies. I saw that play out with my mother, that even birthing children, it was a process that she felt disconnected from.
Yeah. So the disconnection and loneliness that you experienced was part of the trauma that you had gone through. What are some of the other examples of intergenerational trauma that maybe you've seen in some of your clients?
Yeah, I see the struggle for folks to really, particularly in the last, I'd say, 10 years, younger folks to not personalize when they experience anxiety, not personalize and have a microaggression. Yeah. And what I mean by that is being in class and somebody making an offhand remark about police violence on the television, or different things that are happening in the socio-political climate, and that taking up their whole day.
Yeah, triggering. Being a trigger, I think you had an experience that you talked about in your chapter where someone asked you, what are you mixed with?
Yes. Yes.
And that's a microaggression.
Yes. And I was actually written up almost at my job for using humor, which is one of the ways that we often, cope, by saying I'm mixed with vodka to this, woman at a brunch who was a Southern white affluent woman from all, means of presentation and even the event that I was doing. So just thinking of that in institutions where we work, the different ways that I think we don't even realize sometimes we pack our armor before we get into the car, the bus, the train, the bike, whatever it is, even walking to wherever we have to go. That armor is significantly higher when you're a person of color with multi-identity, when you're a queer person, when you're a person who is female bodied and has maybe experienced violence or has felt the threat of violence just by being identifying as femme or as a woman.
I want to read just a sentence from your chapter. You said, while from the outside we may see an individual struggle with addiction, thoughts of suicide, or acts of self-harm, these behaviors are often the outcome of intergenerational trauma. that impacts the individual, their family of origin, and their chosen family, as well as the broader community. It can be, as you go on to say, it can be a touchstone for transformational growth. In other words, growth from deep, deep pain. So let's shift a little bit and talk about the multi-identity aspect. In your chapter, you wrote that your story is told through the lens of a cisgender, multi-ethnic, queer femme, first-generation Cuban American. So how did all of those identities affect your lived experience and how you navigate the world?
One, I think I was a very late bloomer because of the impact of development on my brain. You know, as also I want to remind in my story, religion, and not religion necessarily that I now practice, but spirituality is a big part of my grounding, my personal grounding. What's facilitated and accelerated my personal transformation. That doesn't mean anybody has to be religious. The folks that my clients identify from all over the place in terms of spirituality or belief or atheism. But I will say for those different identities, it wasn't safe for me to say that I was experiencing liking both genders in my home. Yeah. So I didn't know until college, really. I had experiences, but I didn't know until I had education presented to me with language for the first time saying, oh, this is what oppression is. Oh, this is what I saw my mom go through. This is what I saw, there was I really do think there is an important piece of what education did to help me process the different ways. So another way that this comes up is I'm often seen as, you're married to a mixed Black man who's an activist in social justice circles. And together we're this great activist partnership. But then that means a lot of my queer identity doesn't get seen because I'm seen as, oh, you're femme presenting and you're next to a man. And so the safety issue of, is it safe for me to be my full authentic self, was a question that always came up. And I think it was that question, grappling with it and starting to make headway in my early 20s, that then said, I want to help other people. And also, I started having conversations with people about these things and recognized when we talked about them, we had a sense of joy and release that, oh, you're not alone. Oh, I'm not the only person that, like me and my friends always talk about the mixed kid club, how code switching becomes almost like their first language.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the last little bits that we have here, how do you go about helping your clients interrupt that cycle of intergenerational trauma and build the authentic life that you're mentioning?
Yeah. I will say that there's 3 questions I ask everybody. They're questions that I even ask my son. And it's the questions that I asked my partner when we started dating and he had a panic attack because he was feeling love for the first time. When you're going somewhere or you're going towards a person, a meeting, an event, anything, how are you feeling when you're going there?
Okay.
How do you feel when you get there? And how do you feel when you leave?
What do you learn from those questions, from the answers to those questions?
What is going on in my body, right? Like if you're going to an event and every time you go to that space, right? And there's a client or myself, I'm experiencing a clench in my stomach. I've had to learn how to differentiate. There's general fear and anxiety that comes up with new things in life. But then there's deeper sense of this doesn't feel good to me. I think when we are experiencing trauma in our bodies or we experience intergenerational trauma, we can be so disconnected from our gut, right? Yeah. So those 3 questions allow my clients to tap into what's happening in my body every time I go here. When I come back, how do I feel? When I am around this person, How do I feel about myself? Do I feel safe?
Mm.
What am I thinking, feeling, and where does that live?
So I think it also helps to people to ground themselves in reality rather than to be disconnected as many or dissociated as many trauma survivors are. They immediately dissociate from their feelings as a form of protection.
And I also, I think writing has been a huge practice, but also my practice that I began of exploring somatics, meaning really somatic therapy about how does trauma live in our actual biology. I was very interested in your TED Talk that talks about the epigenetics. Yeah, of how memory, we see now what my mom even went through in pregnancy. We see now that research is tying that we can feel those, like you said, activators. I also think that I often tell one of the things that I did, but also what I help my clients do is figure out who are they? What are their parts? What is the narrative that we tell ourselves? I think that abundance mindset is something I talk a lot about. I'll define that as rather than going down the line of my hair's not good enough, or I'm not Black enough to be in this space. I'm not educated enough to take up a space. I can't do this because my parents never said I could, or because my grandparents didn't think I should, or because a queer person doesn't do these things. Whatever the case, as a married person, I invite people to be open to the idea of challenging those narratives and first affirming, look at where you are now. I had to do that today before this meeting. I had to remind myself because I can still struggle with imposter syndrome. And people say, oh, you worked at this, you've done that. You don't have that. But yes, I do. I do still struggle with these things. And I think the first step is being honest about this exists in our families. I talk to my son. I invite my son to have big emotions. I invite him to tell me which way he wants to do his hair. What are the kids saying in school? What are his difficulties?
Yeah, that communication is so important for him to learn to feel safe, which many people who are survivors of trauma never had the opportunity to learn to be themselves and feel safe being themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. And when he has a bad day and screams, and I have all the things that I'm sure my mother had, right? Of, oh my God, what do I do? And instead of running away or topping it off with some sort of numbing agent, I tell my 9-year-old son, let's get into the shower and we're going to rinse for 3 minutes, which is, it's actually a nervous system reset.
Oh, okay. That's wonderful.
Yeah. I take these little things and I just say, let's try this and see what works. And it's amazing how it shifts the energy in the body and in the room.
Wow. You have such a rich amount of lived experience. We could do 2 or 3 of these interviews. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. And
Thank you.
hopefully, as time goes on, maybe I can have you back again because we didn't touch on a lot of things that you have experienced. But I hope the listeners have really gotten the message that you put in your chapter. And I encourage people, obviously, to read your chapter because it's even richer than this interview is. So
Yep.
Thanks again, Tiffany, for being on the show. And I really appreciate all the hard work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it as well.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the Inclusive Minds podcast so we can let you know when the next great guest comes on. The link to subscribe is in the caption below.